Well, I think this is our moment then. I think everyone's seated, and thank you for your help with that. My name is Barbara Ullman. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center at the University of Oregon, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this evening's talk. We've been anticipating this one with great pleasure for a very long time, and it's great to see it come to fruition. Our speaker this evening is Robert Darnton, who has been at Harvard University since 2007. At Harvard, he is the Carl P. Pforzheimer University Professor and Director of the University Library. Before moving to Harvard, Darnton had a long career at Princeton, where he was the Shelby Cullom Davis Professor of European History, the longtime Director of the Program in European Cultural Studies, and the Director of the Center for the Study of Books and Media. It's worth mentioning that before he accepted an academic position, he spent some time as a reporter for the New York Times. And I should say that I could take the entire time allotted today to give you this man's intellectual trajectory, so I'm going to try and keep it very short and let you listen to him instead of me, but it's a daunting task to introduce someone with Professor Darnton's profile. I admit here in public for the first time that I have had an intellectual crush on Robert Darnton for several decades. His work as an historian of 18th century French culture and the book trade dates back several decades as well. His work began to appear in book and article form in the late 1960s. His CV is the size of a small phone book, and I can't hope to do it justice here. The 24 books to his credit include Berlin Journal, 1989-1990, a journalistic volume on the fall of the Berlin Wall that is obviously very timely again at this 20th anniversary of that event. The provocatively titled The Forbidden Bestsellers of Pre-Revolutionary France came out in 1995 and won the National Book Critics Circle Award. The Corpus of Clandestine Literature in France, 1769 to 1789, also appeared in 1995. And George Washington's False Teeth, an unconventional guide to the 18th century, was published in 2003 and has been translated into German, Portuguese, Estonian, Spanish, Italian, and Hebrew. I think I got them all. There may be some of you in the audience who were disappointed when we changed the topic of Professor Darnton's talk from the originally announced talk on the 18th century, for which he had given us the intriguing title, The Devil in the Holy Water, or the Art of Slander in 18th Century France. That talk is based on another book to appear very shortly, and Professor Darnton has graciously assured me that if anyone would like to ask questions on that topic, he will be happy to entertain them after the presentation tonight. You might also want to talk to him about it if you stay for our book sale and book signing, which Professor Darnton will do out in the lobby right outside the room after the lecture. I should hasten to say that it was our decision, not Professor Darnton's, to change the topic of the talk. We did so when we discovered that yet another book of his was about to hit the bookstands, a collection of essays perfectly suited to our theme for the year. That theme is the year of the book, a deep, broad, big notion that has captured the attention of the entire campus. I invite you to have a look at our website. You can find it at Oregon Humanities Center off the U of O homepage. And to look at the posters that we're getting up all over campus. This beautiful piece of work has some of the events, but not all of them. There are many, 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 many units across campus have decided to jump on the bandwagon, and the year of the book is being featured in every corner, from Agate Street all the way over to the bookstore. Given that the book is the object of our discussions for this year, how could we not ask Professor Darnton to speak on the topic of his newest volume, which is entitled The Case for Books, Past, Present, and Future. Published by Public Affairs of New York, it is a delight for the intellect and all the senses, which is true to Darnton's interest in the way human beings interact with books, how they smell, how they feel, how they look, and the way our use of them has changed over the 20 centuries or so since the Codex was invented. The Case for Books, this latest work, showcases what Darnton is so very good at and what draws me back to his work with every new publication. He has a gift for taking high concept and translating it into cogent, readable prose of real interest and import to any reader with intellectual curiosity. The topic of the future of books in the face of digital media could not be more timely. You will no doubt have seen it come up over and over in the New York Times, in Times Magazine last week, in the New York Review of Books, just to name a few, and in leading newspapers across the world, including very recently France's leading journal, Le Monde. Darnton is here today to deliver the Oregon Humanities Center Kritikos Lecture for 2009-2010. The Kritikos Professorship in the Humanities was established with a sizable gift in 1993 from some very generous supporters to the center. Its purpose is to bring to the university and the state of Oregon distinguished scholars, critics, and leaders in the humanities in order to promote, I quote, intellectual honesty and freedom and recognition of the worth of open and honest civic discussion and critical analysis of differing viewpoints and values, end of quote. Given the intense and sometimes contentious debate surrounding digitization, the changing nature of libraries, our access to knowledge, and the generation gap in uses of new technology, a debate that Darnton is squarely in the middle of, I can't think of a better person to speak as our Kritikos lecturer this evening. Like all Kritikos professors, who are known for speaking their minds, Darnton's address this evening is sure to raise difficult issues and ask questions that you will leave pondering. Please join us for many of the other Year of the Book events during this academic season that will allow us to continue that very big discussion. Before leaving the podium, I want to acknowledge the other members of the Oregon Humanities Center for all their hard work to make Professor Darnton's visit happen. That includes the design of the striking posters, all the travel and hospitality arrangements. So much appreciation, therefore, to Julia Hayden, Melissa Gustafson, Peg Gearhart, and our stalwart helpers and allies, including Lindsay Henriksen, who was at the door, I think, tonight. And now let's get on with the main event. Please join me in welcoming Robert Darnton.
Well, I am just delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be part of the Year of the Book. Let's extend the year. I think a century would be about right. I'm loving it here. I've been here once before, but not nearly enough, and I've just had some terrific Pinot, Oregon Pinot 2008. It may have changed my life. I'll try to be coherent, though. I'm a happy man, and I'm just delighted to be here. One of the things, actually, I'm happy about is that you did not ask me to lecture on the death of the book. I think I receive an invitation to address that topic, maybe once a week or once a month anyhow. It reminds me of one of my favorite graffiti in, the men's room of the University Library in Princeton, where someone wrote, you may have seen a similar one, "God is dead," signed Nietzsche. And then someone else wrote underneath, "Nietzsche is dead," signed God. No, the book is not dead, not even nearly dead. But we are going through very troubled times, and we don't know what the future is going to be, the future of books in general, but in particular, the future of research libraries. How can we prepare for this uncertain future? It's not at all clear. And the question about the library's future, I do not think can be dismissed as academic, one of those questions that professors knock about without any consequences for the general citizenry. Why? Well, because the future of the library goes to the heart of what every citizen seeks every day. That is to say, information and help in sorting through information for pertinent knowledge. So we're trying to figure out this future, and when I do, I naturally look into the past. Here, for example, is a futuristic fantasy published in 1771 by Louis-Sébastien Mercier in his best-selling utopian novel, The Year 2440. Mercier falls asleep and wakes up in the Paris that will exist 7 centuries after his birth, which was 1740. He finds himself in a society purged of all of the evils of the old regime. And in the climactic chapter of Volume 1, he visits the National Library, expecting to see thousands of volumes arrayed magnificently as they had been under Louis XV in the Bibliothèque du Roi. To his astonishment, however, he finds only a very modest room with 4 small bookcases. What happened to the enormous quantity of printed matter that had accumulated since the 18th century, when it was already cluttering up libraries? He asks the librarian. The answer? We burned it. 50,000 dictionaries, 100,000 works of poetry, 800,000 volumes of law, 1,600,000 travel books, and 1 billion novels. A commission of virtuous scholars read through it all, eliminated the falsehoods, and boiled it down to its essence. A few basic truths and moral precepts which fit easily into the 4 small closets. Now, Mercier was a militant advocate of the Enlightenment. He was a true believer in the power of the printed word, and he did not favor burning books. But his fantasy expressed a sentiment that I think has now become an obsession for many of us, the sense of being overwhelmed by information and of helplessness before the need to find pertinent material amidst this mountain of ephemera. Information overload is not new. It has oppressed readers, certainly since the 16th century, probably much longer than that, but it now poses problems for designing the libraries of the future. Should they be electronic? Should they be nearly bookless? Should they be similar to the reading room imagined by Mercier? In place of his residual bookcases, the future library could contain computers linked to search engines, which would sort through millions of texts in digital databanks in order to supply readers with exactly what they want. Sound far-fetched? It already exists, although it does not call itself a library. It is called Google Book Search. Now, I will return to that topic in a minute, but first I want to emphasize a point that is easily forgotten in the hubbub over Google, over electronic readers, over espresso book machines, and other technological innovations, namely that printed books are holding up very well. In fact, the production of the standard old-fashioned book has increased steadily through the first decades of the so-called digital era. According to Bowker's, 700,000 new titles appeared worldwide in 1998, 859,000 in 2003, and 976,000 in 2007. Despite the economic downturn of the last year, 1 million new titles will soon be produced worldwide every year. So books are just continuing to thrive. And when people say to you, the book is dead, don't believe them. The staying power of the Venerable Codex illustrates, I think, a general principle in the history of communication. One medium does not displace another, at least not in the short run. Manuscript publishing flourished long after Gutenberg's invention. We have lots of new scholarship on manuscript editions, which are enormously important right up to the 19th century. And not only did manuscript publishing continue to do well, but newspapers did not wipe out the printed book. The radio did not replace the newspaper. Television did not destroy the radio. And the internet did not make viewers abandon their television sets. In fact, the availability of a book by open access on the internet probably stimulates sales of that same book in print form. Does technological change, therefore, offer a reassuring message about continuity? No. I think the invention of electronic modes of communication is at least as revolutionary as the invention of printing with movable type, and we are having as much difficulty in assimilating it as readers did in the 15th century when they confronted printed texts. Here, for example, is a letter by Nicola Turati, a learned Italian classicist, to Francesco Guarneria, written in 1471, less than 20 years after Gutenberg's invention. I'll quote it at some length, but I think you'll see what I'm driving at. My dear Francesco, I have lately kept praising the age in which we live because of the great, indeed divine gift of the new kind of writing which was recently brought to us from Germany. In fact, I saw a single man printing in a single month as much as could be written by hand by several persons in a year. It was for this reason that I was led to hope that within a short time we should have such a large quantity of books that there wouldn't be a single work which could not be procured because of lack of means or scarcity. Yet, oh, false and all too human thoughts, I see that things turned out quite differently from what I had hoped. Because now that anyone is free to print whatever they wish, they often disregard that which is best and instead write merely for the sake of entertainment what would best be forgotten, or better still, be erased from all the books. And even when they write something worthwhile, they twist it and corrupt it to the point where it would be much better to do without such books, rather than having 1,000 copies spreading falsehoods over the whole world. End quote. Now, Turati sounds like some of the critics of Google book search, myself included, who regret the textual imperfections and bibliographical inexactitudes of this new kind of writing brought to us over the internet. Whatever the future may be, it will be digital. And the present, I think, is a time of transition when printed and digital modes of communication coexist. Already, we are witnessing the disappearance of familiar items. The typewriter, now consigned to antique shops. The postcard, a curiosity. The handwritten letter, beyond the capacity of most young people who can't write in cursive script. The daily newspaper, extinct in many cities. The local bookshop, replaced by chains, which themselves are threatened by internet distributors like Amazon. And the library? It can look like the most archaic institution of all. And if it does not adapt to modern technology, it will be replaced by Google. By digitizing holdings from, at last count, 30 research libraries, Google is creating a database composed of millions of books, so many millions that soon it will have constructed a digital mega library greater than anything ever imagined except by Borges. What distinguishes Google's library from others is not digitization in itself, for that exists everywhere, but rather the scale of the scanning and its purpose. Google is a commercial enterprise whose primary goal is to make money. Libraries exist to supply books to readers, books and other materials, some of them digitized. The underlying commercial mission of Google emerged in full view on October 28, 2008, when it announced that it had reached a settlement with a group of authors and publishers who were suing it for alleged breach of copyright. The settlement created a complex mechanism for sharing the income that will be generated by selling access to Google's database. Its most important provision from the perspective of research libraries is an institutional subscription. By paying an annual fee to Google, the libraries will make it possible for readers to tap all the information in the books that Google has digitized. That is, books that are covered by copyright but are out of print, except for books whose copyright owners have chosen not to make them available through the institutional subscription. I know that sounds like a mouthful, but just think of this combination. Books out of print in copyright. And we're talking about millions and millions of books. So this is going to be the basis of the digital library of the future. Now, the bargain, that is getting access to this digital library for a subscription fee, looked dubious to some of us in charge of the libraries. We had provided Google with the books free of charge in the first place, and now we were being asked to buy them back along with those of our sister libraries in digitized form. More important, we worried that Google was creating a monopoly of a new kind, potentially greater than any that had previously existed, a monopoly of access to information. Now, the people at Google find the M word objectionable. To spare their sensitivity, one could speak of a hegemonic, financially unbeatable, technologically unassailable, and legally invulnerable enterprise that can crush all opposition. But in plain English, Google Book Search is a monopoly. It is a monopoly for three reasons. First, de facto. After Microsoft abandoned the field, no competitor had the technological and the financial power to stand up to Google. Second, because of the class action character of the suit, the settlement covers all authors in the class of rights holders. Therefore, a rival to Google would have to win the agreement of every owner of a copyright and to settle innumerable suits for copyright infringements at rates that would range from $30,000 at a bare minimum to more than $100,000. At the same time, the settlement would make Google and the plaintiffs the effective owners of books whose copyrights have not been claimed. That's a complex issue involving millions of works, many of them so-called orphan books. Third, the settlement contains a most favored nation clause, which prevents any competitor from receiving better terms than those accorded to Google. So we're talking about a monopoly that is really very solidly established. But monopolies are not necessarily bad. In the case of communication by telephone service and travel by railroad, a single company might provide better service than a profusion of competing companies. Google could bring its magnificent digital library within the range of readers in public libraries and small colleges everywhere in the United States, perhaps someday everywhere in the world. So please don't get me wrong. I think this is a great idea, and I'm a kind of Google enthusiast, even though Google somehow doesn't believe that. The question is, do we want one commercial enterprise to have exclusive control of so much information? Libraries are already worried about turning over records of their patrons to the government, as could be required by the Patriot Act. Google could know more about us than the CIA, the FBI, and the IRS combined. It could know what we read, what we buy, whom we visit, how many square feet we have in our bedroom, what messages we are likely to we actually exchange with our correspondents, and then, if it gets its algorithms right, what we are probably to think when faced with a decision. Not that there is anything satanic about Google's ambitions or even insincere about its slogan, "Do no evil." The growth of Google's power will merely result from the success of its business plan. Like any business, its first obligation is to produce a profit for its shareholders, not to worry about the welfare of the public. It may seem that the public has nothing to fear from a monopoly of access to information because, of course, information exists everywhere. We are drowning in it. But consider the power inherent in Google's gatekeeping function. Anyone who commands the portals to digital data can act as a toll collector, making you pay to enter the information highway. In the case of books, the digital copies in Google's database will belong to Google, and Google can charge any price it likes for access to them. It will own a vast stretch of the road. Now, the settlement includes some vague guidelines for setting prices, but it contains no provision for seriously preventing them from skyrocketing. Google will have to agree on price levels with something called a book rights registry, which will handle copyright claims and disperse payments. But the registry will be run by representatives of the authors and publishers who will have an interest in ratcheting up the prices. The party with the greatest interest of all is the public. Yet the public has no voice in the settlement. Libraries, schools, universities, ordinary citizens, everyone who reads books but does not belong to the class of copyright owners, all are excluded from the courtroom deliberations that will determine the settlement's fate. If the judge adheres to standard practices in class action suits, he may limit his role to verifying that the settlement treats the interests of the contending parties fairly. If he takes a broad view of the issues, he could refuse to authorize the settlement and direct the parties to come back with an improved version. The improvements could include: 1, regular monitoring of prices by a public authority; 2, representation of libraries and readers on the registry; 3, a provision for unclaimed works to be made available for digitization by potential competitors to Google; 4, a requirement that Google seek an antitrust consent decree from the Department of Justice to prevent it from abusing its monopolistic power; and 5, some measure to protect the privacy of individuals from Google's all-seeing electronic eye. One could imagine an even happier ending: legislation that would make all of Google's data publicly available. Any citizen could consult it, and any company could exploit it. The copyright laws would have to be rewritten, the rights holders compensated, and Google indemnified for its investment in scanning. It could keep its secret algorithms and continue its search service, but its data bank would become public property. We would have a national digital library. Now, this may sound a little esoteric. It's really important. And we are going to find out tomorrow what sort of adjustment to the settlement is actually taking place. Because tomorrow, a revised version of the settlement will be filed with a district court in the Southern District of New York. And I think a very large stretch of the digital landscape is about to be determined without any consultation of the public. So what Judge Denny Chin decides is really important. It's hard to dramatize a very complex legal document, the settlement, but I think it's truly important. Well, So much for that subject, and you could say that this dream of a national digital library is as impossible as Mercier's utopia. To bring the discussion down to a more realistic level, I think it would be best to assume that some version of Google Book Search will survive as a private enterprise. What then will be the role of research libraries in the new digital environment? If Google emerges triumphant from the court, it may eclipse any library that refuses to subscribe to its service. And meanwhile, it may exploit an argument that has been the strongest point in its defense. It can make most of the world's literature available to readers who have no access to a well-stocked library. It can democratize knowledge, and it can do so more effectively than many of the greatest libraries whose doors are closed to the general public. Now, I take this argument seriously because in the United States, those libraries often belong to exclusive universities, such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, etc. Although they admit researchers from the outside world, they generally reserve their riches for their faculty and students, or, as Google might put it, the privileged few. So I've got to build an argument in defense of such libraries. The argument against exclusiveness struck me with particular force long before the Google affair, when I enjoyed myself the privilege of being a graduate student at Oxford University. In my day, the Oxford colleges were shut off from outsiders by high walls topped with spikes and jagged glass. The gates of my own college, St. John's, slammed shut at 10 o'clock in the evening. If you were outside after 10, you could ring a bell and pay a fine, or you could try to scale the wall, which was a daunting experience unless you were tipped off by a fellow student who knew of some clandestine passage by way of a lamppost or a low-hanging roof, a gap in the spikes, or some other chink in the fortification, which the dean of students left unguarded, according to an implicit contract allowing boys to be boys. Except for a few female establishments, the colleges were then exclusively male. The barrier to outsiders, I don't know how many of you have seen these Oxford and Cambridge colleges, but the walls are enormous, 15 feet, 20 feet high with these spikes on top. They're not exactly welcoming to the general public. The barriers that these colleges set up to outsiders, combined with the insider knowledge of how to break the rules, reinforced a general sense of exclusiveness in Oxford. If the architecture were not enough to get across the message, you could read about it in Thomas Hardy's Jude the Obscure, which describes Jude's attempts to penetrate into the world of learning behind Oxford's forbidding walls. Now, I haven't reread the novel in years, but as I remember it from discussions with my fellow students in St. John's College, Jude, a worker who cut stones to repair the college buildings, never made contact with the life inside the colleges, and one of his sons succumbed to the curse on the outsider by murdering the other children and then hanging himself in a room of the Lamb and Flag, a pub located just outside a spot in the wall of the college where I used to climb in. So the novel resonated with us, as you could well imagine. Now, the neo-Georgian residential houses of Harvard hardly lend themselves to that kind of melodrama, but they can appear forbidding to outsiders. Harvard's library, however, offers a way for the university to open itself to the public, not physically, because the number of readers would flood the reading rooms and swamp the staff, but digitally, by sharing its intellectual wealth through the internet. Openness is the guiding principle that we will pursue in order to adapt the library to the conditions of the 21st century. Let me cite a few examples, if you will forgive some Harvard parochialism, but I think the examples apply to lots of other research universities, including this one. During the past year, several faculties at Harvard voted in favor of an open access resolution which bound their members to make their scholarly articles accessible from a digital repository. It contained a provision for an automatic waiver to accommodate anyone who wants to opt out, but it meant that the bulk of all future scholarship produced at Harvard would be available free of charge to anyone with access to the internet. The university library established an Office for Scholarly Communication to build and administer the repository and to expand its offerings, which will include digitized dissertations, conference proceedings, special lectures, databases, all sorts of gray literature, as we call it. The library has also created an open collections program in order to make some of its richest holdings freely available online. It has digitized books, pamphlets, manuscripts, prints, and photographs related to specific themes, such as working women, immigration, epidemics, scientific explorations, and the cultural heritage of Islam. The material has been translated into 72 languages and consulted by hundreds of thousands of readers located around the world. Outreach to the rest of the world is a responsibility that weighs heavily on research libraries in general, Harvard in particular, because the University of Harvard contains so much material that does not exist elsewhere. Archives that go back to the founding of the college in 1636 reveal a great deal about the origins of education in America and of America itself. Special collections throughout the library system contain much of importance to other countries. Harvard's Yenqing Library has more than 200 unique copies of Chinese works. They too will be digitized along with 51,542 rare volumes in a cooperative open access project to be conducted with the National Library of China. Harvard hopes to digitize its Ukrainian material, the greatest collection in the world and one of vital importance to the Ukrainian people because they lost so much of their literature during the tragedies that overwhelmed Ukraine during the 20th century. So we want to digitize all of our Ukrainian works. Harvard's enormous collections in zoology, botany, and medicine are also being digitized and made available through open access projects, such as the Biodiversity Heritage Library and the Journals of the Public Library of Science. Research libraries in other universities have equally important holdings, and all of us, I think, must assume responsibility for collecting material that will be crucial for research in the future. Nearly all of that material will be, as we say, born digital. We therefore face a daunting problem because software and hardware are become obsolete, as you know, in just a few years. Digital texts are extremely fragile, and they can easily get lost in cyberspace owing to the inadequacy of the metadata for finding them. We've been struggling with this problem at Harvard through a program called the Library Digital Initiative. Although we've not come even close to solving it, we are experimenting with interim solutions through pilot projects designed to harvest material from websites, store it, reformat it, and make it openly accessible. We are also developing plans to archive the millions of messages exchanged within the university by email. The email problem exists, of course, everywhere, notably within the United States government. To be sure, the Committee on the Records of Government exaggerated the threat when it proclaimed in 1985 that, quote, the United States is in danger of losing its memory, end quote. And the notorious loss of the 1960 census is actually a myth. By elaborate and expensive engineering, the Census Bureau recovered most of the data that in 1976 appeared to be irretrievable owing to obsolescent software and hardware. But most government agencies used email by the end of the 1980s, and most of that correspondence has been lost. Not all of the 6 million email messages exchanged each year by the Clinton White House, but apparently even more from the Bush administration between 2001 and 2005, and more still from lower levels of government. We have not yet solved the problem of creating archives that will preserve an adequate record of life in the 21st century. While struggling with this fundamental technological difficulty, we must find a way to overcome the financial obstacles to maintaining our collections at an adequate level. The hyperinflation in the price of scholarly journals is a case in point. Many of them cost more than $1,000 a year, a few as much as $30,000 to subscribe to one journal. The pressure on library budgets is so great that we may have reached a tipping point, and the balance may shift in favor of a new business model, one in which the cost of publication could be financed at the production end instead of by the consumer. The shift is already occurring in sectors such as science, medicine, and technology, where authors are usually expected to pay a publication fee. The best example, I think, is the Public Library of Science Biology, an online, peer-reviewed, open-access journal of the very highest quality, which provides articles that can be downloaded, read, and reprinted by anyone free of charge. It pays for its expenses by charging authors a publication fee of $2,850 per article. The fee is usually covered by research grants because funding agencies consider publication a small but important fraction of the investment in scientific research. And if the author cannot afford the fee, the journal waives it. Well, business models of this kind may look feasible in biology and physics, but would they work in fields of the humanities and the social sciences that receive little funding for research? Harvard has recently adopted a plan to subsidize publication fees for scholars in all fields who write for open access journals. Preliminary calculations suggest that it would not be ruinously expensive to pay a subsidy for each article by a Harvard professor up to a limit fixed in an annual budget. And if this kind of financial support spread to other universities, the moderately priced open access journals would gradually replace the costly commercial journals, and all universities would save far more by eliminating subscriptions than they would pay in publication fees. So far, Cornell, Dartmouth, MIT, and the University of California at Berkeley have joined Harvard in this project, and we hope that it will spread far and wide. And I'm pleased to know that the University of Oregon has a similar plan. Skeptics might object that only wealthy universities could afford such a policy, and that it would place scholars in poorer universities at a disadvantage, especially in developing countries. But the subsidies to their journals should be adequate for them to waive the publication fee for any author who could not afford to pay it. By collective action, we should be able to reverse the direction of the economic forces, and once the turnaround in financing gathers momentum, nothing should stop it. Most journals would shift to open access publishing, including small journals in the humanities, which ought to flourish in the new environment. Meanwhile, the relief from expenses for subscriptions would free library budgets to spend more on monographs. But the monograph itself will change. Most authors today produce electronic texts, and most publishers maintain their backlists in digital repositories. A world in which books are born digital and readers are digital natives is a world in which research libraries will no longer need to stock huge amounts of current literature in printed form. Print on demand and improved electronic readers will be sufficient to satisfy immediate needs. Now, don't get me wrong. That world still seems far away, and we cannot reduce our acquisitions of printed monographs until we have solved a great many problems, above all, the problem of preserving digital texts. So when and if that future is assured, research libraries will be able to concentrate on what has always been their strength: special collections. Those collections in the future may involve materials of a kind that we cannot imagine today, but they will be richer than ever in their holdings of old-fashioned books and manuscripts. Having hoarded their treasures for centuries, libraries will at last be able to share them with the rest of the world. Google will have scanned nearly everything in standard collections, but it will not have penetrated deeply into rare book rooms and archives where the most important discoveries are to be made. By digitizing their special collections and making them available on open access, research libraries will have realized a crucial aspect of their mission. However, I may be letting my fondness for books of the past distort my vision of the future. No matter how advanced the technology, I cannot imagine that a digitized image of an old book will provide anything comparable to the excitement of contact with the original. When I was just to give you one more personal anecdote, if I may, when I was a freshman at Harvard in 1957, I discovered that undergraduates were allowed in Houghton Library, the rare book library of Harvard. Summoning up my courage, I walked in and I asked if, as I'd also heard, the library possessed Melville's copy of Emerson's essays. It appeared on my desk in a matter of minutes. Because Melville had written extensive notes in the margins, I found myself reading Emerson through Melville's eyes, or at least attempting to do so. One bit of marginalia has remained fixed in my memory. It had to do with Melville's experience of rounding Cape Horn in what must be the roughest water in the world. At that time, I thought the world in general was pretty rough, so I was primed to sympathize with a caustic note next to a passage about stormy weather. Emerson had been expatiating on the world soul and the transient nature of suffering, which, as any sailor could testify, he said, would blow over like a storm. Melville wondered in the margin whether Emerson had any idea of the terror faced by sailors on whaling ships at the Horn. I read it as a lesson about the Pollyannish side of Emerson's philosophy. Well, back in Harvard, a half-century later, the memory suddenly surfaced, accompanied by a question: had I got it right? Never mind about all the appointments on the calendar, I hot-footed it to Houghton Library again. Now, the opportunity to experiment with déjà vu does not come often. Here is the result, a passage on page 216 of Prudence in Essays by R.W. Emerson, Boston, 1847, which Melville marked in pencil in the outer margin with a big X. Quote, here's Emerson: "The terrors of the storm are chiefly confined to the parlor and the cabin. The drover, the sailor, buffets it all day, and his health renews itself as vigorous a pulse under the sleet as under the sun of June, end quote. Pollyannish, no? At the bottom of the page, Melville scribbled another X and wrote, quote, "To one who has weathered Cape Horn as a common sailor, what stuff all this is," end quote. Well, the marginal remark was even sharper than I had recollected, and the sensation of holding Melville's Emerson, a small volume in a cheap cloth binding, in my own hands, it was even more moving. That kind of experience can only be had in rare book rooms. Yet a digitized image of page 216 of Prudence would be enough to help anyone try to read Emerson through Melville. In fact, digitization can make it possible to see things that are invisible to the naked eye, to the unaided eye, as scholars have learned by manipulating digital versions of text like the oldest manuscript of Beowulf. Now, of course, the current situation calls for more than hit or miss initiatives in digitizing special collections. If research libraries are to flourish in the future, they must band together. They prospered in the 20th century by pursuing self-interest independently of one another and of interference by the state. But in the 21st century, they face the impossible task of advancing on two fronts, the analog and the digital. Their acquisitions budgets cannot bear the weight. Therefore, they must form coalitions, agreeing to invest in some subjects while leaving others to their allies. They must develop common off-site depositories, perfect interlibrary loans, exchange documents electronically, prepare interoperative metadata, integrate their catalogs, and coordinate their digitizing. Experiments of this time have been tried and failed, I know, but we must try again. Through trial and error, we must inch forward toward the creation of a national and then an international digital library. Google has demonstrated its feasibility and also the danger of getting it wrong. That is, of favoring private profit at the expense of the public good. Technological changes wash over the information landscape too rapidly for anyone to know what it will look like 10 years from now. But now is the time to act if we want to channel change for the benefit of everyone. We need action by the state to prevent monopoly and interaction among the libraries to promote a common program. Digitize and democratize. It's not an easy formula, but it's the only one that will do if we really mean to realize the ideal of a republic of letters which once seemed hopelessly utopian. Thank you.
Professor Darnton is very happy to take questions. Because we're taping the lecture in order to put it online, of course, we'd love it if you could come to the microphones in the aisles to ask your questions. That way we'll be able to capture your question and his answer as well. And a quick request. Every once in a while, we ask people to let us know how they heard about a lecture or an event. We haven't done it in some time, but if you have a pen or can borrow one and would let us know how you heard about this event, that would be very helpful. No need to give your name unless you'd like to be listed for our hard copy newsletter or the electronic newsletter, but any comments you have and any information you can give us on which publicity is reaching you would be very helpful. And now, if you have questions, please step to the mic, and I'll ask Professor Darnton to take over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Can everybody hear me? Is this on? Now it's on. There we go. Thank you for your lecture. I just came from Brandeis University, which, as you know, is in a battle over selling its museum collections to fill a university deficit. And I was wondering if you might comment on how the digitization process for libraries might come into play in this battle, because as you digitize the books, you know, whether or not this can be used as a rationale for selling special collections books to make money in private institutions and that such.
Well, Brandeis has a terrible financial problem, and I would be the last person to tell them how to solve it. So I'm ducking your question, but I must say I would not advise them to sell the special collections that they've built up over the years. I mean, this is an asset that is just very valuable, but that a lot of people take for granted. In general, I think faculty and students take their libraries for granted. But now is the moment when libraries are really hurting. I feel myself, but you know, I'm, as they say, preaching to the choir, that at least at Harvard, the library is the most important asset of the whole university, more important than the faculty. Professors come and go. The library is forever. So the last thing you should do, I think, is to get rid of books in your special collections.
Thank you.
I think one way to democratize Google would be to treat it as a utility. And the internet is a utility because the federal government set it up and maintains the core of the system. I'd also like to recommend Google Watch. Google-watch.org is the best deconstruction of Google actually doing evil that I have come across. Google-watch.org. So Google is a utility, maybe publicly owned.
Yes, well, now I have not at all said Google does evil. I think the danger is that Google or someone who may own Google 10 years from now could abuse this power. That's what I worry about. After all, Google was founded, as you know, in 1998. I mean, just yesterday, practically. And companies come and go. But this is a company that will be in charge of this fabulous, really national asset. And I think we need controls lest it be abused.
It's already beyond control.
Google America. So just paraphrasing you in framing my question, do we want it? Do we want something so ubiquitous, omniscient, dominating, and controlling as part of our national defense? And as national defense is the most powerful country in the globe, and do we need to increase our defense expenditures to defend Google as a technological infiltration of all there is? Having said that, why don't you compare it to oil, the information highway, to the old feudal system of charging a toll every time you wanted to pass a fiefdom? You had to pay another toll. And this is the same as a river of information. And books can be parallel to our medical records and everything else. And why don't you look at it as a new economy, for one? And two, why don't you look at it as oil, as something that depletes the Earth's resources, because it uses so many metals and rare substances that have to be mined and devastate other nations to support this monster that we don't need. And it's also very rude. It introduces rudeness and coldness to our culture. And I went around thanking people at Columbia University for not having their laptops out. Every place you go, in every restaurant, in every cafe, every street corner, every park bench, like has happened in Berkeley. It looks like a factory town. And I wonder why we don't look at this thing with contempt and condemnation and allow them to take over every apparatus, our legal system, our medical system, our energy system, and every single thing. And how can we stop it? Maybe we should look at it as the next abortion clinic, the next animal experimentation, attitudinal framework type thing. So the question is, why are you trying to sell this thing to us? You know, it's a high-class selling. It's high-class selling. It's privileged selling, trying to get the elitism of Melville, intonation of Melville and Emerson, you know, to... Let him answer. Well, I want your answer.
Well, I'm impressed with your moral indignation, and I try to sympathize with what you're saying, but I honestly don't think that the people in Google are wicked or evil, and I certainly wouldn't compare them to the robber barons of the 19th century. I think we're facing a new phenomenon that we must try to understand. One of the big differences between oil on the one hand and information on the internet on the other hand is that if you take away oil from one source, you deplete that source and use it for some other purpose. If you exchange a message on the internet, you don't take anything away from its origin, you spread information. It was Thomas Jefferson who said that if I use one of the, what do they call, a taper to light someone else's candle, my own light is not diminished while his is created. And I think that messages on the internet are like that, that they really can be a democratizing force, and that the internet itself is a great force for spreading information and knowledge, pretty much as in the ideals of the Enlightenment. It's just that during the 18th century, only a tiny fraction of people were capable of reading, much less of buying books. So now we're in another world where all of us are capable of participating in the general spread of information and knowledge. That's why I think the basic idea of Google Book Search is a great idea. It will make available millions of books to people who don't have access to great libraries. So the principle, I think, is excellent. What I'm arguing is not that it should exist simply without controls for the public good. So this, I agree with you, is a moment when the public should intervene, and we should have an opportunity to limit the power of what I see as a monopoly. But I would not characterize this monopoly as wicked in itself. Part of the problem is they're so good at what they do. I mean, they're terrific engineers. They provide an excellent service. So I'm not in any way deprecating Google, but rather trying to say there should be room in this new digital world for the public to have a voice. So I think we need libraries, readers on the book rights registry that's going to set prices. I think we need the federal government to have some controls in case the prices spin out of control the way they have in the case of scientific periodicals. So there's a real danger, I think, of the monopolization of this information highway, and now is the time to do something about it.
Hi. Very good lecture. I was just reminded about the internet. Back in 1987, the New Yorker published a cartoon with a couple of dogs sitting in front of a terminal. Yeah. One says to the other one, no one knows you're a dog on the internet.
That's right.
Which is sort of another way of stating the question of how valuable is something like Wikipedia. But I have a couple questions. Number one is on this class action settlement that you mentioned. You said it was currently in a district court, which means that it's got at least a couple of levels to go. Who are the other, are there any amicus briefs being filed, and who's involved in this suit? And the second question is, where is the Library of Congress in all of this? You didn't mention that.
Right. I'll begin with the second question, and the answer is simple: I don't know. The Library of Congress has not, as far as I know, been actively involved in this at all. The Copyright Office has, and that's part of the Library of Congress, so I should modify what I've said. And the head of the Copyright Office has declared that Google is in effect making copyright law through this private litigation. It's changing copyright law if the settlement goes through. To try to answer the first part of your question, The settlement was raised a lot of opposition for the reasons I've given. And this opposition grew and grew. It was expressed in articles, in blogs, in discussions, and finally in amicus briefs and memoranda filed with the Southern District Court in New York. So we know now what the objections have been, because there are more than 400 of these memoranda that have been filed with the court. And you can read them. They're online. I've studied them. They're very interesting. One of them is from the French Republic. Another is from the Federal Republic of Germany. There are many from library associations, and one is from the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice said the settlement in its original form violates antitrust law.
Which Department of Justice, Bush or Obama?
The current Department of Justice.
Okay.
So this is new, and the Department of Justice has been looking into Google as a monopoly, a potential monopoly, and have said the settlement should not be endorsed by the court in its current form. But it also said, we think that Google Book Search has a potential of great good for the American people. So what's going to happen? In the face of this opposition, Google and the plaintiffs, that is the Authors Guild and the Association of American Publishers, withdrew the original settlement and asked the court for a postponement. So it was supposed to be filed on October 7th, and they were given by the court until November 9th, last Monday. Now, for some of us who are historians, the date November 9 reverberates like anything. November 9, 1989 is when the Berlin Wall fell. Well, I won't go on and on, but that's Kristallnacht in Germany, the beginning of anti-Semitism on a very large scale. It's the end of the empire. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated on November 9th, and Germany became a republic.
But it's just another day.
Anyhow, I shouldn't lapse into a history lecture, but last Monday for me just resonated as a very important date, and I was at the edge of my chair waiting to find out what the revised settlement would be, because Google and the plaintiffs had to rewrite it to make it more palatable to the court. Well, November 9th came and went, and they couldn't get their revised settlement filed on time. They asked the judge, Denny Chin, to give them a little bit more time, and he said, okay, I'll give you until tomorrow. So tomorrow, we will learn what the revisions in the original settlement are. And the question is, will they make room for the public good? Will there be some provision to prevent the abuse of pricing? Will there be protections about privacy? There are a lot of questions that are hanging, and they are, in my opinion, very important questions. Mm-hmm. But I think you're absolutely right in saying this is a district court, and whatever is decided will be appealed for sure from court to court over the next maybe year, maybe 2 years. So we don't know the end of this story, and fortunately there's lots of time for the public to intervene and to try to make sure that this new digital future will be one that will be for the good of all of us.
Thank you.
Bob, tomorrow's Friday the 13th.
It is? I know, I was aware of that.
Yes, hello. In relationship to the digitalization of books, do you feel that the digitalization of such a large, primarily Western body of information would be conducive to further Westernization of cultures around the world, or do you think it would provide, in contrast to that, a forum for which indigenous cultures could eventually, with the introduction of technological sources, provide a preservation of their own native culture?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to answer that question. In Harvard, I can speak for the Harvard University Library, 60% of our books are not U.S. books. The great majority of our holdings are from outside the U.S. And that's not surprising, because it would be indeed surprising if we thought that most knowledge is produced inside the US. I mean, that's simply absurd. In the first place, I think if we could get such libraries digitized, this would not privilege necessarily US-based knowledge, because the libraries reflect the global character of knowledge itself. Although you might say to me, well, okay, maybe Harvard has a lot of foreign books, but that's not true of all research libraries, and that the balance is not equal. I think on the whole that probably is true. And there has been an attack on Google, actually, by the former head of the French National Library, Jean-Noël Jeanneney, who basically argued that Google was a form of American cultural imperialism, which is, I think, what you are suggesting in your question. I myself would not go that far. I think, actually, that Google, I've got to know the people in Google pretty well. Google wants to digitize everything in the world. It's very active in China. It's all over Europe. It's in Latin America. It doesn't care what the language is or what the script of the language is. It's working on optical recognition systems so that it can digitize all kinds of books in non-Western languages. And potentially, Google, I think, will create an international database that will not be simply pushing the American version of culture. So I actually do see it as a democratizing force of a global nature, one that will bring the world closer together and make cultures readable from one end to the other. So I'm, in that sense, quite optimistic and enthusiastic about Google.
Thank you very much.
Let me take one last question.
I actually have a question that's not about Google. It's about your Harvard's open access mandate, and I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of how many faculty are embracing that and how many are opting out.
It's a very good question, because as you probably know, there are other open access policies that have been adopted elsewhere, and the conformance rate of faculty is miserable. In the case of the University of California, I think it's less than 4% of faculty have actually deposited articles in their open access repository. In the case of the National Institutes of Health, which is a related, similar program, the figure was about 4% also. So basically, people will vote in favor of this great idea and then not do anything to make it happen. What we are trying to do at Harvard is to get a high compliance rate. We try to do it by educating the faculty. I mean, they're educated in their own subjects, but they're not necessarily conversant with the problems of libraries, and they're busy people. So they think, well, okay, I finished this article, I've sent it off, but I've got to prepare a lecture, I need to go shopping for the kids, I'll do it mañana. And that's a danger. So we have recruited a group of students called Open Access Fellows. The acronym is OAFs. And they're rather proud to be OAFs. These Open Access Fellows are assigned to go to particular departments in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and to explain to the professors that it's really not very complicated. And then we redesign the mechanism so that all you have to do if you don't want to follow the simple instructions on your computer screen is to take the article as it already exists and send it as an email attachment to this Office for Scholarly Communications, which I've set up. It's very easy, and it's working. So the compliance rate is now about a third of the faculty, and that's only in a relatively short time. So I think that we will get over 50% of the faculty by the end of this year, and that will be the highest compliance rate, I think, known anywhere, and it will keep getting higher. So it can be done, but it takes a lot of work, and you can't just assume that goodwill on the part of the faculty will make it happen automatically.
Thank you.
one last question, and then we'll let Professor Darton sign his books.
This may not be a good time to ask this question, because this is a very technical question. Something you were very aware of, but I'm not sure that you can respond to it. You've been speaking about the issues of monopoly, the settlement, the revision of the settlement, and so forth, in the context of the American legal system. And if it goes to the end of that system, it'll be the Supreme Court. The problem is that this phenomenon, and let's take the phenomenon of monopoly, is not regulated by the same law. I'll take the example that I know best in the European Union. Microsoft, for instance, has had a tremendous problem passing through the American legal system in terms of what's recognizable, and a tremendous problem in getting that accepted in European Union legal context. The question really is there really an implicit American imperialism? I'm not talking about cultural sense, but in a legal sense, what's resolved in America is going to be imposed legally upon the rest of the world because of American power? Or is there a potential within other legal systems, and particularly the European Union system, which is much more attentive to the place and the position of the public in the sphere? I mean, this is the big cultural divide between America and Europe right now, is the public, the collectivity has much more recognition of rights. Can they resist the American settlement?
No, I follow that, and I think it's a very good question. In fact, it goes to the heart of the objections filed with the court by the French government and the German government. It's fascinating to read these documents because they express precisely that. They begin, actually, with a list of their great writers. I mean, it's really interesting. You know, the French say, Racine and Molière up through Sartre and so on, and the Germans say Goethe and Schiller up through Böll and Günter Grass, and the French say we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the Germans say we invented printing, and they invoke this cultural past, and they're doing this in depositions sent to Judge Denny Chin. Now, if I may say so, Judge Denny Chin was, I think, 2 years old when his family immigrated to America from China. And he was raised in Hell's Kitchen in New York. From very poor parents. His father worked in a restaurant. His mother, I forget exactly what she did. They were gritty, hardworking immigrants, not from the world of Goethe and Schiller, but from the world of the immigrants that made this country. And Judge Chin got a scholarship to Princeton and made his way up into the judicial system. So what's he going to think when, you know, everyone's invoking their cultural past? I just think anthropologically it's fascinating, but it doesn't answer your question. What the Germans and the French argued was precisely what you said. Why can an American class action suit determine the rights of authors and publishers in Germany and in France? It's unjust. And indeed, the rights as defined in Germany and France are quite different from those defined here. They have a so-called moral copyright in France, which is very important. And furthermore, the class of authors from the American Authors Guild, by definition, excludes the Germans, the French, and everyone else in other countries. So their fate is being determined by a class to which they don't belong, and by this peculiar American legal system that has class action suits, and they don't have such a thing. So they say, this is unjust. And I think they're right. Now, maybe this is something that we'll find out about tomorrow, because I think that the court is going to be cognizant of this. But then there's more to it than that. Why can't we have a conversation with the Europeans? Well, frankly, I have had conversations with the Europeans myself, including the heads of some major libraries, and we are all worried about the same thing. So I think there's a potential, at least in the world of libraries, for us to get together and to articulate the need for a kind of decent general world of protection of copyright that would apply equally to everyone in all countries, and at the same time to protect the public good, of which, exactly as you said, the Europeans are very conscious. So we need to raise the consciousness in this country, I think, for that to happen.
I think we'll end there. Thank you so much.